Chosen one, welcome, radiant ones, the unshakable, the rising, the real. You didn't stumble on this message by accident. You were summoned here. Because what's on the other side of this screen isn't just another talk. It's a reminder of your power, a revival of your clarity, and a reclaiming of every ounce of energy you gave to people who never deserved front row seats to your journey. Let's get one thing clear. You are not average. You're not someone who fades into the background. You are the atmosphere. You walk in and shift the vibration without saying a word. And yet, people tried you, tried to test you, tried to play with you like you didn't come from fire. But here's the truth they couldn't handle. You don't chase energy. You are the source. You don't compete for crumbs. You command rooms with presence. And when they tried to make you question your value through games, what they really did was light the match that exposed them. So this space right here, this isn't just a video. It's your confirmation. It's your mirror. It's your revival. The old version of you who tolerated the bare minimum, gone. The new version, limitless, grounded, chosen. And today, we're unlocking every piece of truth they hoped you'd never see. No fluff, no filter, just pure power. Let's get into it. Looking for purpose and peace? Hit subscribe and start the journey. They assumed you were playing the same game, unaware you weren't even in the arena. Their tactics were rooted in a shallow script: provoke, flaunt, suggest your absence meant loss. But they never understood the depth you operate from. Where they sought to spark envy, they encountered stillness, a silence not born of defeat, but of a knowing far beyond reaction. Their attempts to sway you landed like pebbles against a mountain. You don't crumble under projections that don't belong to you. They mistook your calm for disinterest, not realizing it was clarity choosing not to entertain chaos. They believed that waving distractions in your face would disturb your core. But your worth was never sourced from validation, nor tied to visibility in someone else's narrative. You weren't trying to be chosen. You already knew you were whole. They performed for attention, waiting for you to flinch. Instead, you vanished from their stage entirely. And in that absence, their illusion cracked. Their display wasn't threatening, it was revealing. It showed the lengths to which some will go to disturb a piece they can't possess. They wanted you to question your value, but you had already built it in places they could never access. The quiet unnerved them because it spoke louder than confrontation. It whispered truths they hoped you hadn't realized. That you don't have to battle for what is yours, and you don't mirror the insecurity of others. You don't compete where your energy is too vast to be confined. And in the end, they were never your opponent. Only the echo of their own fears. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. They miscalculated the equation, thinking they could reduce your presence by rationing affection, as if withholding what was never theirs to begin with would somehow elevate their worth. A strange theater of scarcity unfolded, built on shadows and suggestion, hoping you'd forget that the well was always within you. They wrapped distance in confusion, turned silence into a weapon, and dangled half-hearted attention like it was treasure. But the truth couldn't be bent. The current flowed from your spirit, not their approval. They tried to cast themselves as the reward, the one to chase, not realizing they were drawing from your light the whole time. When they began sprinkling false replacements and curated illusions to stir your uncertainty, all they really did was reveal how afraid they were of your awakening. They couldn't sustain sincerity. It required a depth they'd never cultivated. So instead of giving you truth, they stayed detours, not to protect themselves, but to preserve the illusion of dominance. Yet what unraveled wasn't you. It was the game. You saw it clearly, not as an accident, but a design meant to shrink your worth into a currency to be earned. You watched them trade authenticity for spectacle, believing the performance would leave you questioning your place. But you didn't fold. You simply stood still while their theater collapsed. Your ache didn't come from longing. It came from watching someone distort something real in an effort to gain momentary leverage. They assembled noise, new faces, rehearsed delight, but it echoed hollow. Cutting the line to the source didn't make them sovereign. It made them unanchored. And soon, the quiet they once imposed became the silence they feared. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of a sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor his kingdom. May his grace guide you always. All the attention they had once deflected now became their hunger. The connection they disregarded became their echo. But you had already stepped forward, not out of pride, but clarity. You didn't leave a bond. You left the illusion of one. What they painted as mystery was simply misdirection, and you no longer played along. They gained nothing in trying to shrink you. All they managed was the absence of what had always made them feel stable, and the realization that it had never come from them in the first place. They reached for manipulation not out of confidence, but desperation masquerading as control. This wasn't about affection or retaliation. It was about trying to flip the script when they realized they had no say in your storyline. The moment you no longer orbited their approval, the show began. Calculated provocations designed not to express truth, but to stir a reaction, as if anger or confusion would confirm you still cared. That was the only language their ego could understand. What they couldn't fathom was that calm isn't apathy, it's strength. And silence isn't surrender, it's power. The second they needed to spark discomfort to feel seen, the confession was already made. Because provoking is never the strategy of someone secure. It's the act of someone who doubts their place. That's the line they never crossed. While you created impact without speaking, they had to construct noise just to feel acknowledged. When they waved distractions in your path, it wasn't to share joy. It was to scratch at old wounds they hoped were still open. But they didn't realize the version they aimed for was already gone. You weren't dodging the trap. You'd simply outgrown it. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. Your piece wasn't a shield. It was evolution. Their manipulation didn't fail because it was flawed. It failed because you were no longer someone who could be shaped by chaos. That's why they faltered. They expected collapse, but watched you ascend. They thought withholding would control the outcome, but found themselves responding to your refusal to respond. The irony. In trying to shake your stability, they revealed how anchored they were in your presence. They weren't pulling strings, they were unraveling. And in that unraveling, the truth emerged. What they needed wasn't your jealousy, but your light. Yet all they managed to prove was that the power they tried to reclaim had never belonged to them. They weren't threatened by your presence. They were startled by what it revealed. Without lifting a finger, you disturbed a narrative they were desperately trying to maintain. It wasn't your joy, your strength, or even your refusal to participate that unsettled them. It was the way you quietly held everything they were performing. Not because you aimed to expose them, but because simply being whole made their fractures harder to hide. They didn't view you as a person, but as a standard they couldn't reach without pretending. Every room you entered made them feel more like a character in a story they didn't write. You weren't in competition. You were in alignment. Still, they tossed darts in your direction, gossip, exclusion, stage praise for others, hoping it would destabilize you. But what fell apart wasn't you. It was their grip on the false image they clung to. Their resentment wasn't born from wounds you caused, but from the mirror you unknowingly became. Every time you responded with grace instead of retaliation, their bitterness deepened. Each step you took forward, without reacting to their orchestrated tension, amplified their discomfort, because they weren't equipped to face a person who didn't play the game. And even more, they couldn't bear watching someone live what they were still faking. So they unraveled trying to appear steady, built alliances that lacked loyalty, replaced sincerity with appearances, and all the while, the very thing they tried to prove they didn't need, your steadiness, your integrity, became the absence they couldn't ignore. The battle they created was never against you. It was against a version of themselves they couldn't live up to. And in the end, their hostility wasn't aimed at your light. It was fired at their own shadow. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of his sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor his kingdom. May his grace guide you always. They misunderstood stillness as avoidance, assuming the quiet meant you were emotionally absent. But stillness is often where wisdom resides. They projected immaturity onto your restraint because they couldn't grasp that peace sometimes sounds like silence. You weren't attached out of indifference. You were simply done allowing dysfunction to rent space in your nervous system. They had grown used to the chaos, the loops, the traps, the unspoken tests. You had once been caught in them too, until you realized that choosing not to engage wasn't giving up, it was waking up. You no longer needed to explain your worth to people who were determined not to understand it. You weren't afraid of feeling. You were just unwilling to be pulled back into what you had already healed from. They expected volatility, the old familiar spirals. But you'd learned how much emotional labor peace requires. You'd seen the pattern repeat, and instead of reacting, you chose removal. That's what shifted the energy. You weren't building walls. You were drawing new maps. Maps that led away from self-betrayal and toward clarity. To them, it looked like a shut door. To you, it was a reclaimed threshold. Your emotional boundaries weren't a cage. They were an evolved compass. And they couldn't navigate your new terrain, not because it was cold, but because it required a different language, one they hadn't yet learned. What unnerved them wasn't your absence. It was your refusal to be baited. They thrived on discord, and when you offered stillness instead, it forced them into a confrontation with their own noise. They didn't lose you to indifference. They lost you to growth. And no performance could reverse a decision made in alignment. Because by the time they noticed the distance, you weren't avoiding anything. You had simply risen beyond reach. They attempted to manufacture chaos by surrounding themselves with a rotating cast of characters, not for connection, but for spectacle. Each new addition wasn't chosen out of affection, but for the reaction they hoped it would provoke. Public displays, sudden friendships, and recycled attachments all served one purpose: disruption. They believed proximity to others would dilute your impact, make you question your significance. But what they staged as strength was really a distraction from an internal emptiness they couldn't outrun. None of those connections had depth, they were appearances, stitched together for visibility, not meaning. A performance assembled from borrowed faces and shallow bonds, hoping to evoke envy from someone who had already left the theater. But their strategy crumbled when the audience started seeing the pattern. Repetition without sincerity. The people they used began to notice the script, realizing they were roles in someone else's unresolved narrative, not participants in something real. The more they tried to construct a facade of wholeness, the more the illusion unraveled. They underestimated what happens when others recognize they're being instrumentalized, not valued. Eventually, those drawn into the display began to pull back, not out of malice, but clarity. What was meant to showcase control became an exposé of confusion. And while they were busy crafting scenes, your only role was to remain unmoved. There was no need to retaliate or explain. Stillness spoke louder than defense. Every attempt to use others as leverage ended up backfiring. What they revealed, unintentionally, was that the loss they denied still lingered, and that your absence was never about bitterness, but discernment. The more they tried to replace your presence with noise, the louder the emptiness echoed. Not because you responded, but because you didn't. They assumed you'd be diminished by the crowd, but all they did was prove that authenticity can't be substituted. While they turned people into props, they exposed a truth they couldn't cover. You were never just a part of a story. You were the part they couldn't recreate. And every spotlight they lit to outshine, you only ended up illuminating their own void. They thought bending the truth would shape perception in their favor. With every twisted word and dramatized tale, they aimed to reconstruct your image into something small enough to control. The intention wasn't to correct a wrong. It was to rewrite the narrative entirely, hoping you'd shrink to fit their script. But while they were rehearsing scenes built on distortion, you were living in alignment with your truth. They disguised malice as honesty and spite as concern. The retellings, the gossip, the subtle digs, all aimed to discredit you before you even had a chance to speak. Yet what they didn't expect was how truth behaves over time. They underestimated the patience of clarity, the endurance of integrity. They thought you'd break under pressure, but you simply rose beyond their reach. No retaliation, no defense, just presence. And that alone began to shift things. Slowly, the cracks in their version of the story began to show. Inconsistencies surfaced. Reactions didn't match reality. People began questioning not you, but them, because the person in front of them contradicted every rumor whispered in dark corners. The weight of their fabrications didn't fall on you. It returned to them. And that's when it began, the unraveling. The more you grew, the more obvious their insecurity became. Your quiet progress was louder than their loud opinions. What they had once told others began to reflect back onto them, not as facts, but as evidence of projection. Every time you rose with compassion, every time you moved forward without resentment, you created a contrast they couldn't explain away. They had planted lies thinking they'd build barriers around you. But those seeds only sprouted accountability. And when the harvest came, they were the ones standing exposed. Their stories couldn't survive the consistency of your growth. Their tactics backfired, not because you fought them, but because you didn't need to. While they attempted to distort your reflection, all they managed to do was reveal their own. They thought their words would bury you. Instead, they planted reminders of who you really are. What was meant to destroy became the proof of your endurance. And while they stood confused by how their version collapsed, you stood quietly in truth, unshaken, unchanged, and undeniably still rising. If your heart overflows with divine love, now is the moment to let it shine. Click the super thank you button on YouTube and give $50 or more to help carry God's light to others. Your gift will bless not only your life, but countless others. You are part of His sacred plan. Your kindness may be the answer to someone's prayer. Share your blessings and honor His kingdom. May His grace guide you always. They weren't seeking your envy. They were starving for validation masked as dominance. This wasn't about romance or closure. It was a calculated reach for control disguised as indifference. They wanted to tip the scale by performing confidence, manufacturing scenes that might shake you, and crafting silence that sounded louder than any confession. It was never just to move forward. It was to watch you freeze, unsure, small. They fed on the image of you wondering what went wrong. Subtle digs, indirect provocations, empty gestures dressed up as progress. All tools in a quiet attempt to sit higher by hoping you'd kneel emotionally. But you didn't. You stayed upright, steady, unmoved. While they stirred tension behind the curtain, you held peace like armor. You didn't return the serve. You didn't join the charade. You didn't echo the energy. And that's where their illusion began to crumble. Because they weren't dealing with someone lost in reaction anymore. They were standing before someone who had already walked out of the storm. The silence they thought would create confusion only mirrored back their chaos. And when you didn't respond with desperation or doubt, the weight of their game shifted. It no longer felt like triumph to them. It felt like loss. It wasn't about whether they had someone else or seemed content. It was that, even surrounded by noise, they couldn't silence the truth. They never had the influence they pretended to. Their tactics didn't move you, they exposed them. And what once felt like strategy quickly turned into an unraveling. The stage lights faded. The audience drifted. There was no climax, just the realization that all the noise failed to produce the reaction they'd built everything around. They didn't cause envy. They uncovered their own irrelevance. And the image of superiority they tried so hard to sculpt cracked in the presence of your peace. Not because you fought them, but because you didn't need to. Step beyond screen. Join and help light the way for others. They stepped into a storm they couldn't predict, thinking they were in control of winds they didn't create. What began as a subtle manipulation quickly spiraled into something larger than they anticipated. They tried to provoke confusion, to twist emotions into knots, to weave illusions tight enough that you'd question your own clarity. But they underestimated what it means to interfere with something protected by a higher order. This wasn't about strategy. This was a miscalculation of spiritual consequence. They believed the damage would stay hidden, that small wounds would never surface, that the disruption they planted would remain private. But energies don't forget, and the imbalance they set in motion began demanding a cost. Not through chaos, but through correction. The universe, often quiet in its judgments, started shifting the ground beneath them. Where they once stood surrounded, they found themselves isolated. Connections they counted on grew distant. The spotlight they craved dimmed into indifference. Anxiety replaced control. And the very tactics used to fracture others began to return with unrelenting precision. Because when you're guided by something sacred, your silence is not weakness, it's witness. You didn't retaliate. You didn't retaliate, scheme, or plead for justice. You simply walked in alignment with your truth and allowed time to do what noise never could reveal. And that's what shook them. They wanted power over your perception. What they got was a mirror to their own disarray. The harm they masked as minor played out in full color, not because you exposed it, but because truth makes itself known. Slowly, steadily, without needing a defense. Their attempt to manipulate wasn't just unkind. It triggered a deeper reordering, one where their actions confronted them without your interference. And in the echo of what they lost, respect, peace, influence, was the evidence that they'd stepped outside their bounds. They didn't just try to shake you. They stepped into terrain guarded by forces they don't understand. And in doing so, they learned that some paths aren't meant to be toyed with, because what looks like silence from you may just be protection echoing from something far greater. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. They were never chasing balance, only the sensation of dominance. But what they fed on wasn't real strength. It was the imitation, fueled by your confusion, your overcompensating, your vulnerability. They weren't interested in resolution. They were intoxicated by the idea that your emotions revolved around them. Every unanswered question, every silent punishment they delivered, every emotional knot they tied was crafted to sustain their illusion of control. And for a while, they mistook your reaction as their validation. But control built on illusion always collapses when the source of that illusion walks away. And that's what happened. When you no longer bent to their moods, when you stopped chasing invisible answers, when your voice stopped echoing in their theater, they lost more than your attention. They lost their grip on a power they never actually held, because what they had mistaken as dominance was simply your generosity in motion. The withdrawal wasn't loud. It was final. And without your warmth, their entire act turned cold. What once felt like influence now felt like absence. The presence they manipulated became the void they couldn't refill. New connections felt like placeholders. Forced laughter turned into noise. They couldn't admit it out loud, but their identity was unraveling, thread by thread, in silence. You weren't their downfall, the illusion was. You didn't dismantle them. You simply stopped pouring into what was never reciprocal. And without your energy to feed off, the cracks in their mask grew wider. The game they built to trap you ended up caging them, because in their pursuit of control, they gave away the only real thing they had, the connection. Now all they hold are fragments of a power trip that led to nowhere, and the echo of a presence they'll never reclaim. They believed their every move was clever, that their subtle tactics, ambiguous signals, and orchestrated appearances were calculated plays in a match they thought they were winning. They mistook your stillness for submission, unaware that you were never engaging. You were deciphering. While they played with perception, you observed the mechanics. Not out of fear, but clarity. Not to retaliate, but to confirm what you already sensed. Their patterns weren't invisible to you. You saw how they engineered silence as control, leveraged proximity as bait, and paraded false connections to feign power. But you weren't watching to react. You were learning. You weren't entangled, you were evolving. And every attempt they made to manipulate your emotions only sharpened your discernment. They thought they were drawing you closer through confusion. Instead, they mapped out the exact route that led you out. Because the more they tried to twist the narrative, the more you saw the design. You didn't respond with anger. You responded with understanding. And when that understanding crystallized, you didn't announce your departure. You simply stopped participating. Step beyond the screen. Join and help light the way for others. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic reveal. Just quiet mastery. You left with your peace intact and your self-respect elevated. And it wasn't until the game was over that they realized they were never controlling the board. They were part of a pattern you'd already outgrown. While they believed they were crafting a checkmate, they failed to notice the one holding the blueprint had already walked away, with every piece of themselves intact. And that's when it hit. They weren't the opponent. They were the repetition. And you were finally done repeating it.